how is it that we can be conservative if we remove funding from programs that prevent disease?
You see, people are not going to die. And if they are going to die, we're going to be merciful, which is why PEPFAR was not defunded.
So Menko makes a good point, which is that we have sort of a sudden cut in aid.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Rafiki Broadcasting. And this is the second episode of Hear My Cry. And today we have a very important topic. As we heard last Thursday, the U.S. Senate or Senate Republican chopped off the head of the U.S. aid. We know famine has been something that has been prevalent in Africa and in most third world countries. And the U.S. aid is that organization that has been trying to alleviate hunger and other conditions in those areas. So the question is, cutting the head of the U.S. aid, what impact will it have on these countries and these areas that so much need it? We have the conservative views that says we don't really need to support the entire world. We don't need to send money across the entire world when our people here are suffering. But the progressive view is of that they need to have a humanitarian sympathy to the suffering of the world. So joining us on the studio today, we have Rob Smith. You know him already. He was here for the first episode. He's a ferry engineer, and we introduced him last time. And there is someone also, he is a conservative, by the way. And we have also an engineer, a PhD in psychology, a smart guy. So his name is David Scratchley. So David is joining us all the way from Seattle, and it's quite early from Seattle. So gentlemen, welcome to the show. Welcome, Dave. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you, Minko. It's good to be here.
So my question then is for Dave. So why do you think it's important to keep the USAID as it was before the Trump administration?
And thank you. It's a wonderful topic. And I do think it's important we keep USAID going. And I would ask the entire audience to answer this question. How is it that we can be conservative if we remove funding from programs that prevent disease, grow economies, reduce dependency? What I see here is that we are increasing the instability of nations that may be dependent upon some aspect of USAID. At the same time, we are asking people to engage in behaviors that will help us stabilize our nation without maybe building their markets or working to work regionally to build trade partners and to help us to increase our presence in communities in a humanitarian manner. So I would ask Rob, my esteemed co-host here today, how is it conservative to remove the funding from programs that prevent disease or grow economies?
Yeah, so that's a valid question. And before I answer that, Dave, let me ask some clarifying questions on your position. And from what I'm hearing is that your understanding is that what's happened in the last 2 days, Senate 2 days ago, and then the House passed it last night, so it's heading to President Trump's desk, is that the impact from your perspective, so just correct me if I'm wrong, the impact of those actions will be that people will be harmed, people will die, instability will occur, where perhaps the program is allowing stability at the moment. Am I understanding that?
Very accurate, very accurate. In other words, how do we, by cutting funding, increase stability in regions and decrease instability by, say, denying malaria nets or not helping with vaccinations?
So that's a good question. So you've asked me a question before I've sort of laid out my thoughts. So let me answer your question by stating a position that I think represents. Boy, these Hadidas are certainly wanting to be part of this discussion. And again, as I said last week, reminds us of where we are here in South Africa.
Yeah, man.
Very South African to hear those birds in the background. But I think I can represent a conservative perspective on USAID, partially based on my own experience here. When I first started getting involved in Africa, it was the height of the AIDS crisis. ARV drugs were desperately needed, and through USAID, President Bush, Jr. W. Bush, started one of the most successful USAID programs, probably in its entire existence, which is the PEPFAR, the President's Emergency Plan for HIV, PEPFAR, which, by the way, was spared in the cutting down of USAID. They have defunded USAID except for PEPFAR, which I'm very pleased about, because there people will die immediately. But what I have observed in the 25 years now that I've been involved in Africa, and I would presume that this is similar to USAID funding throughout the world, is that with every administration, there's a knee-jerk different set of expectations for the country that's receiving the money. And because we've had sort of unrestrained growth of government, we've had unrestrained growth of pet projects through PEPFAR, you see. And so I think that what the desire is of the conservatives is to do what Trump is doing throughout this bloated government, and that is sort of a bit of shock and awe, and then come back to the table and fund what needs to be funded. Because in my experience, there's been some terrible things being funded. Particularly, for example, I'm in the board of a group in the Sudan where we are protecting the Christians that are getting persecuted by the warring Islamists, who are getting 90% of the money from USAID. And so they are not having to feed their own people, and they can spend the money they get on weapons because we're taking care of what their government should take care of. And then the impact of that war is that now the other 10% of the PEPFAR money is now protecting the people that have got injured from part of what the 90% has done. I'll also say, in South Africa, and when PEPFAR was initiated, if you recall, George W. Bush was very active, like Trump is becoming more, of integrating faith and Christian principles into the whole issue of what causes AIDS. So PEPFAR during George Bush's era was spent with a significant amount of USAID money, also promoting abstinence, you see, and trying to correct the lifestyle that was causing AIDS, scoffed at by the left, and then as soon as Obama came in, that was scrapped. And so what you see is us doing the right thing by helping victims of the AIDS crisis get affordable drugs, but without equally talking about what causes it and trying to put preventative measures and improving the lives of the men who are positive, continue to spread the disease. And then along comes another administration and then says, okay, you can get your PEPFAR money, but you're only going to get it if you promote values that we don't agree with here in many countries in Africa, which is the whole far left, gay and lesbian lifestyle acceptance, or gay marriage acceptance, or something that is not a problem in an African country the same way that it might be in a Western country. It's not seen the same way. And so all of a sudden, life-saving money is tied to something that doesn't serve the cause of the United States. It's just an ideological drive or message that is sent out because now you've got a different leaning. So on the one hand, you had Christian values being promoted with Bush, and then when Obama came in, you had very non-Christian values promoted. And in fact, the values that promoted it are tied to the HIV crisis. You can't run from the fact, particularly in the United States, that the HIV crisis is very, very related to men-on-men sex. And so here you have got one group promoting it in order to get the very PEPFAR money, you see, and then and that's just PEPFAR, and then you go to all the other programs. And so to come back to now answer your question, Dave, directly, and then you'll get the floor again if Minko so directs, and that is that other than PEPFAR, people are not dying. We are funding many of those types of programs through private foundations and through other private organizations, but also many of those programs are funded almost entirely by the United States. And why should not the whole world say we need to be involved in this and not make it a United States initiative? But I would say that people are not dying other than from HIV/AIDS at the moment. This is a wonderful time actually to cut all the funding, because like we see in the United States, if you continue to prop up countries, they never learn to prop themselves up. If you're going to continue to give out subsidies for food and have a social network for people that aren't working, they're going to continue to not work. You see, and we saw that with with Bill Clinton in the 90s, when you put a work requirement on your support network, people start to work and people take responsibility. And so this assumption that Africa somehow can't survive without billions and billions and billions of dollars of paying for every single need that they have just keeps us continually dependent, and is, in my viewpoint, quite dehumanizing. So there's a response, and Dave, I'd love to hear your perspective on it, but Minko, you may have a question or two.
Yeah. Okay. Dave, so what I get from Rob is that the US aid has been misused and mismanaged, and has served the purpose for which it was not initially intended. And that is the cry of the conservative.
Correct.
So now, what is your thought on that point where the conservatives think that US aid is funding extremism and radical ideology?
Okay, thank you, Menko. I think Rob's points regarding, say, funding of groups that are persecuting other people, that needs to be stopped. That, in my mind, is a national security issue. It's something that we should address at the level of how is it that funding of any type reaches militants or extremists of any perspective, whether it's through USAID or through the smuggling of various resources or whatever the case may be. That's deplorable and must be stopped, obviously. So that's a great point, Rob, but I think we need to be careful that we don't throw, in the States here, we like to say we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? We take a look at, for example, the PEPFAR group, which was really a very effective program in many regards, right? If we look at the spread of HIV in Africa, one distinguishing factor of HIV in Africa versus in the States is it was predominantly a heterosexual condition in Africa. So is there a value issue? There may be a value issue regarding sexual behavior there, granted, but it is probably not a similar condition to what we saw in, say, the spread of the 1980s and so forth here in the United States. It's a little bit different there. So I look at this and I think when I look at the entire picture here, I think we have to ask ourselves, what is it that is allowing Africa to go forward? If we are not supporting Africa and they are gaining their own strength and independence, that's a wonderful thing. We would applaud that at all times, but strategically, what is the position the United States wants to have in the communities that have been affected by the cuts in USAID? Do we want to continue to remain a strong force of democracy? Do we want to give that away to China, to Russia, to other countries that may step in and support infrastructure development? Or do we want to be able to come in and use benevolent, stabilizing force of aid to assist people? I agree that every single administration that I've lived through, and there have been a number, we see changes, and those changes are quite frustrating to me as an American. One day we're going down this route, and we're looking at the world from the perspective of, say, a liberal or maybe somebody who's a centrist. Next day, we're over here looking at it from a conservative perspective. In a sense, that's the strength of democracy. That's the strength of a republic. And on the other hand, it makes progress very slow, and it makes it prone to polarization. I'd like to think that at this particular point in time, and I agree with your point that maybe we come back, Rob, and we look and we say, well, where can we use targeted aid better? It's never a bad thing. But on the other hand, I think we need to make sure we don't deepen cycles of conflict, feed authoritarian regimes, and weaken society as we would like to think it may be working within Africa. So I think maybe what we need to do is take a look at how we can not cut all USAID, but how can we strengthen it to promote systems that in the end are strategically beneficial to Africans, to the partnership between Africa and the United States, that diminish the input of regimes such as those in China and other parts of the world that may be counter to our values. So that would be how I view it.
Yeah, I think that hearing your view, I think is very valuable, because what I hear is the same goals that I think the conservatives have, and the same questions that the conservatives ask. And here is my thought: is that we have, I think the number is quite staggering, and this is beyond USAID, but in the last 40 or so years, we've given a couple of $1 trillion worth in various forms of aid to Africa. And during that time period, what we have seen is the incredible growing influence of China, who give their aid in the form of business assistance and loans for bridges and trains and ports, while we're out there, feeding people who aren't necessarily dying. There's no one dying, that's starving to death here, other than war-torn areas. And in those war-torn areas, you'd be surprised how much USAID money has propped up the warmongers, because we care for people, and so we're throwing, in the case of Sudan, hundreds of millions of dollars to prop up the Islamic side of that conflict in ways that we think are not military, but it frees up them then to spend their money on military, which then persecutes the Christians. While the Chinese are helping to build a railroad and helping to build a freeway. And I think that part of what we're seeing, and this is so fundamentally conservative in the United States, but even conservatives, I think, have had this wrong when they've thought of Africa, and that is if we continue to give handouts, we continue to disempower people to strengthen their own communities. You see, and so if we were doing what the Chinese are doing, which is gaining influence in every single country in Africa, and what the Muslims are doing, which is gaining influence in every single country in Africa, and that is to grow their economy, create jobs, create infrastructural changes that allow them to then not be so dependent on us and not need that aid money. You see, and then when there is a legitimate crisis, make it short term, make it with the help of the rest of the world, particularly Europe, that has had such a hand in Africa's history. And so what I'm hoping for is, USAID has lost its head. The bill is going to Trump. The only thing that survived was PEPFAR. I think that we take on a case-by-case basis, as I think our Secretary of State has said, and pull it in the State Department or the Defense Department and say, here's what we're going to strategically do, and focus it around investment in Africa, not necessarily aid in Africa. Aid is for crisis. And as we look at Africa right now, we're not in crisis except for a few areas. Sudan, Ethiopia, civil war, some of northern Nigeria, that's where we can aid, but we need to do it on a temporary basis with an end, so that people get back on their feet. Otherwise, we will keep them poor, and keep them dependent, just as we know in multi-generation ghettos in Chicago and Atlanta.
I don't think it's a conservative or liberal issue to lean into the idea that we don't want to feed a man fish. We want to teach a man to fish. We feed a man fish, we feed him a day. We teach him to fish, we feed him for a lifetime, right? And I hear that about the conservative plea, but is there a way, Rob? And I do think, as we've been sort of pondering this and kind of flailing back and forth, we have lost some of our ability to have influence to, let's say, China, which has invested heavily in roads and railroads and digital infrastructure. And what we need to realize is that we can come into the aid discussion and do it strategically. We don't need to offend the values of those who fund this. On the other hand, if we look at this, it is very, very difficult for me to think of, say, a rise in maternal mortality, right? That's something that has happened as U.S. aid has been cut across Africa. We see that there is a decrease in the viability of children being born. We look at these things and we ask, is this really consistent with the conservative philosophy of valuing life and moving forward? Can we find a thread in here that allows us to say, look at where the USAID has been effective in helping people to become healthier, move forward, not be viewed as a charity, but be viewed as a partner, and at the same time not allow this aid to respond to terrorists or authoritarian figures who may use this money for purposes that are counter to anything that we uphold as values and are damaging to the groups that live amongst these people. So I think when I look at it, I think we may have given away some of our strategic positioning in the region in an attempt to tighten the belt and move broad social issues in a matter of years. I think we need to go beyond the short-term issue and move forward.
So let me respond to that, because what I do see is a very common heart between your position representing a liberal position and my position from a conservative. But given the current political world we're in, the difficulty in doing it gradually, which is what I'm hearing you suggest, is that any implied cut, and we just hear this howl from the left, people will die, this is catastrophic. Even things that are reasonable, not a single Democrat will cross the line and say, let's trim. And so the shock and awe approach allows us to go back now and say, now what should we be funding? Because it's just impossible to cut. Look at the great big beautiful bill. You know, not a single centrist crossed the line, not one. It's amazing that the far right held together, because usually we can't get anything done because the far right killed it and no centrist will cross the line. So how on earth do we trim back the excesses of USAID without cutting its head off and saying, okay, now we've done this, now let's rebuild this in a more practical way? But the programs that have been set up to protect them, which have been going on for decades, get more and more bloated. You know, I saw that in the orphan care, actually. You know, one of the reasons why we decided not to continue Agathos was because the orphan crisis was ridiculously exaggerated, because everybody will give money to orphan care, you see. And so we came in at a crisis, and when the crisis is over, we need to leave, you see. And organizationally, and just from a sort of a broad brush perspective, it's like, boy, you're abandoning orphans. No, we're not abandoning orphans. The crisis is over. There's no point continuing the crisis. Let's be fiscally conservative, and then also allow the communities to rebuild without needing perpetual aid, you see. And so it's just been politically impossible to trim USAID. And then if you trim it, you've got to get, you know, how many years is it going to go through all these programs and decide what's good and what's not good, when everyone is arguing, don't trim my program because people will die.
Dave, do you think perhaps the approach to which the aid, the USID was cut, do you think it was a bit sudden that it did not give countries time to kind of get prepared? Do you think if Trump came to say, okay, I'm giving you 1 year to try to work out, to try to work together through trades, but in the meantime, we are going to gradually suspend the aids. Do you think the progressive would have been happier with that approach rather than just cutting it abruptly like it was done right when he was sworn in?
Right. So let me respond, Nico. First, let me respond and say to Rob, I think, Rob, sensible discussions that bring both sides together are productive discussions, right? And I like this format because you and I are able to talk in a way I hope models for people the sensible guidance of complicated issues. So Menko makes a good point, which is that we have sort of a sudden cut in aid, and sort of the idea behind this, I think, is that Africa should stand on its own 2 feet, and aid creates dependency. And I think when I think about that, I think that true partnership, probably in my mind, is about empowering local leadership and not creating dependency. Yes. Right? So how can we use this aid to empower programs that build self-reliance? And how can we invest in a future for Africa without abandoning it? How can we work in Africa's independence? So in my mind, I think maybe the application of the conservative point of view is maybe harsher than what we might hope to have if the goal is to enhance local leadership through partnership. And so that would be my perspective on it. And I appreciated Menko's question. Very good question.
The difficulty of trimming or evaluating, literally hundreds and hundreds of programs that have, in many cases, existed for decades, given the current political scenario, but even perhaps in a bipartisan world, is a mammoth task where every single organization is going to say, don't cut me. I remember when I started Agathos and we started looking at the orphan crisis, one of the reasons I took a different approach is because if I looked at the budgets and the cry of every group that was looking after orphans, there was so much money, there weren't enough orphans to look after. You see, I mean, there were just institutions where people were getting paid $200,000 or $400,000 to head them up, and then all the layers of highly paid people all taking care of orphans. And if you just did the math, why is there an orphan crisis? I mean, just the amount of money was staggering. And I think so many of these groups getting aid have become just sort of fossilized and institutionalized. And then, as I got into it, I'd realize that half the orphans aren't even orphans, because if you are a poor family, if you sent your child to an orphanage, they got better education. So why not just pretend to be orphans? Which is why we went through the local elders, because everyone was coming and saying, these kids are orphans, and then we find out they've got parents, you see? And so when the aid flows as freely and as liberally as it has in the past, particularly under, I think, under democratic regimes, administrations, there comes a time where you just have to say enough is enough. And that was part of what Doge did. They went in there and they said, you won't believe what's getting funded, and so let's just stop it, reevaluate everything. And even the bloatedness of USAID, I mean, offices all over the world in this department of the United States, is just costing us billions of dollars just to exist before we even write a check to anyone else. And he's saying, we've got the State Department. Let's just reevaluate everything, and the things that are real crises will come back to the State Department. Americans are incredibly generous, both privately and nationally. And we're not going to see a crisis where people are dying and turn our heads. That's just not in our DNA. You see, but why see a crisis and then once it's largely over, which the orphan AIDS crisis mostly is, why end up still spending hundreds of millions of dollars because we created all these institutions that now need to survive, and everyone's going to fight for it to survive, and if you try and cut it, they're going to say people will die. You see, we don't, that doesn't work anymore. You see, people are not going to die, and if they are going to die, we're going to be merciful, which is why PEPFAR was not defunded. And so I'm very proud that in cutting the head off of USAID, the one vital money that needs to keep going is PEPFAR, because their people will die until more people get involved, or they're coming out now. I don't know if you saw, Dave, they're coming out with something you take twice a year. That's coming out. It's going to be much, much cheaper, and then the 400 million that has been saved out of the budget might be able to be cut to 100 million. Who knows? And so it's just cutting the head off and saying the best way to redo this, the best way to incrementally do it, because we can't incrementally do it, is to just cut it off and then rethink it all. But I think we have the same goals, and that's what I really love about hearing you out, Dave. The goals we have is that people prosper, that Africa prospers, that we are a positive force. And then I think what we will see that's been absent is that we want to, through trade, bring about prosperity to all and peace.
Gentlemen, any final words from you, Dave, after that line of thought from Rob?
Okay. Well, yes, I do have some final words. And Rob, I think this is a very, very effective means of communicating common goals, common aspirations. You've said what I believe exactly. We need smart aid. My only comment would be, we do not want to remove all aid, right? The solution isn't to walk away. It's to work directly, in my opinion, with local leaders. It is to find and root out anybody who's supporting false authoritarian or damaging or ideologically opposed regimes that may result in terrorism, the persecution of innocent people. Obviously, we need to stop that. But true partnership is going to come when we empower a local leadership that does not create dependency. I want to make sure the conservatives have not cut the programs that build self-reliance. I think that would be my final words as it relates to this. It's a great discussion. It's one that needs to be held at many levels. And I want to focus on security, not just for the United States, for Africa, not on handouts. And that would be my final thoughts on this matter. So thank you.
So my final thought would be echoing very similar to you, Dave, and that is hearing your cry, hearing your perspectives have really tempered my perspective of the liberals' view, if you are representative of it. We have common goals. We want to see humans thriving, and I think perhaps a sort of middle-of-the-road approach is that as we rebuild aid, perhaps there should be a look at the crisis and a viewpoint that this crisis is not permanent, and so we have a sunset or a reevaluation, like we just have of the tax cuts. The tax cuts of Trump's first term were ending, and so we had to reevaluate them. Do we want to keep them going? Do we not want to keep them going? And so perhaps if there is a war or a crisis of some sort, even including PEPFAR, perhaps we need to say we will continue funding PEPFAR for the next 3 years, and in 2 years' time we'll reevaluate to see what the need is, so that we're not just pumping 400 million in, and the next year there's an inflation rate and a cry for more, and then it's 500 million, and next thing it's $1 billion, when the crisis is malleable and has changed, and people's behavior has changed, or there's more effective medication. And so perhaps the middle ground is to do aid with the sunset clause and reevaluation, assuming that aid is not perpetually needed.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this program. You've heard the views from both sides, the conservative side and the liberal side. there is still a common ground where both parties or where both can trade peacefully. So you've heard at the beginning it was a bit tense, but at the end there was kind of common grounds. And this is where we are trying to bring this podcast to. So you can disagree to agree at the end. So thank you very much. Please type your views, your perspectives in the comment section, and let us know what do you think of cutting off the head of US aid. What does it do to Africa? Is it good or is it bad in your perspective? Thank you. This was Hear My Cry, and from Rafiki Broadcasting, today with us Rob Smith and David Scratchley. Thank you and see you next time.